You are Locked On Longhorns, your daily podcast on the Texas Longhorns. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked On Longhorns, the show. Jonathan Davis, your host, 27 days away from Texas football. But before we get there, we got to get through fall camp, and the Longhorns are currently through 4 fall practices. We've heard a lot of good things coming out of fall camp, so we're going to discuss our takeaways from what we've heard thus far coming out of fall camp. On today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, we're going to talk about the offensive line. We're going to talk about the quarterbacks with Maalik Murphy, Quinn, Ewers, and Hudson. And then we're going to talk about the pass catchers, receivers, and tight ends. And then we're going to talk about the defensive side on all 3 levels, D-line, linebackers, and defensive backs. But let's start with the offensive line. So when the Texas football team arrived to fall camp on Wednesday, if you haven't seen the video, it's on the Texas football Twitter. It kind of gave off the elementary school vibes. They pull up in the yellow school bus. They're all getting off the bus. They have the crossing guard escorting them across the street to the fall camp facility where they'll be practicing. And when you see these players getting off the bus, there's a few that stand out. And one of those that definitely stood out was number 78, true freshman Kelvin Banks. Now, Kelvin Banks is part of this very talented offensive line class that was brought in the 2022 class, part of a top 5 recruiting class coming off a 5-7 season for Sark in his first full year as the University of Texas football coach. And really what was the talk of that top 5 class was the 7 offensive linemen that were brought in that class, because one, the offensive line wasn't great last year for a football team that went 5-7, but 2, this is one of the most historic offensive line classes that we've ever seen in recruiting, specifically at Texas, but really in the country, to bring in the type of talent they brought in at the offensive line position. Bringing in 7 of them is something you don't see a lot in these offensive line classes, in these recruiting classes, period. And because the offensive line wasn't a strength for this football team last year, a lot of people wondered how fast they would be able to come in and make an impact for this football team. And from everything we're hearing in fall camp practices, it seems like really soon. So they have them practicing with the 3rd team, which is customary. They're true freshmen. They need to come in and earn everything. But, when you talk about Kelvin Banks, he's really been the talk of the fall practices thus far. And he's going to be your eventual starting left tackle at the University of Texas. But the question is, how soon will that happen? And from everything we've heard thus far, it looks like that's going to be a real possibility this season, maybe even beginning with week 1 against Louisiana-Monroe. They've talked about his size, but not only his size and the fact that he doesn't look like a true freshman. He looks like a junior or senior, but he knows what he's doing in his reps as well. And definitely is a threat to once again be your starting left tackle on September 3rd against Louisiana-Monroe. That's the hope when you bring in a top 35 prospect on the offensive line in the country. You hope that he could come in and have the pedigree to be a day 1 starter. And it looks like that thus far in his size, and his skill set and his mentality. We heard Bijan Robinson talk about, trying to joke with Kelvin Banks in the weight room, and Kelvin Banks kind of looked at him crazy because he wasn't done, with his set, and he didn't have time to play around, according to Bijan Robinson. So I think when you have that size, when you have that skill set, and when you have that mentality, and when you're rated that high coming out of high school, it speaks volumes. And I think sooner than later, he's going to be your starting left tackle at the University of Texas. But we're hearing the same thing amongst all of these players. Devon Campbell, who was a top 10 recruit in the country out of Arlington Bowie, we've heard the same thing, that, his size is something you notice right away. All of these offensive linemen, we've heard physically imposing. We talked about large humans, and this is the prototypical size that Kyle Flood, who is really good at identifying great offensive linemen and developing great offensive linemen, these are the type of players that he wanted to bring in. And, they talked about how the 3rd team, which is made up of these true freshmen, they just look bigger than the 1st and 2nd team, and they're a little more physically imposing. And Devon Campbell, he matches that from a size perspective, but also a skill set perspective, a player that can play multiple positions on the interior offensive line. And we saw that motor in his ability to dominate interior defensive linemen at Arlington Bowie in high school. There's no secret why he was the top 10 recruit in the country, and I think he's already started to show that thus far, in fall camp practices. And I think it'll be a reason that, sooner than later, at some point this season, he'll end up playing a significant role for the Longhorns, if not starting at one of those offensive line positions. And then Cole Hutson, the one out of the 7 freshmen who enrolled early. He's been here since January. He's already worked his way up to first team reps at right guard. That could be because Junior Angelau was working with the centers. That's something that they're working on at that depth at their position behind Jake Majors. But nonetheless, Cole Hutson was working with the first team at right guard. And we've heard nothing, but the coaching staff rave about his talent and his professional mindset at the position. And he's somebody that I've said on the podcast multiple times, I think, will make a big impact this year and will get a lot of playing time for the Longhorns this year. They've talked about Malik Agbo at his size on the offensive line and his ability, how nimble he is. And then Cam Williams, his ability to make an impact. He's probably the biggest of the offensive linemen. And if he continues to, keep his conditioning right and continue to develop, he's going to make an impact at that tackle position as well. So offensive line, a big question mark going into the season for the Longhorns, but a lot of optimism around this true freshman class. It's going to be really interesting to see not only who makes the starting lineup at some point this season or going into week 1, but also who's going to be on that second team and be ready to go when injuries happen or, lineup changes happen. It's rare that you go through a whole season starting the same 5 offensive linemen for every game. So it looks like this true freshman class has come in ready. They're hungry. They're physically imposing size-wise, and they also have the skill set to make an impact at the University of Texas as early as this season. Moving on to the quarterbacks, we're talking about Quinn Ewers, Hudson Card, and Maalik Murphy. And we've heard a lot of good things about all 3 of them. Quinn Ewers, we've heard about his natural ability to deliver the ball, his ability to make plays, special plays off platform, his ability to, have elite accuracy and ball placement, his ability to put it on the receiver in a position for them to catch the ball and continue running, not have to reach behind them, catch the ball where they can make plays. We know we have a lot of talented playmakers at the receiver and tight end position and at running back catching the ball out of the backfield. Hudson Card, we've heard about his crisp footwork. He looks a lot more crisp than he did last year. His ability to get through progressions is something that people have noticed at fall camp. He just looks a lot more technically sound than he did last year. And then Maalik Murphy, we've heard about his intangibles, his leadership, his ability to light up the room, his energy. He brings a big personality to the room. He's also the biggest quarterback in the room at 6'6", 220. We know that he has a cannon for a right arm, can throw the ball 75 to 80 yards. But we've also heard about his development as a passer mechanically. They've talked about how he has, kind of a faster and a smoother delivery. And he has the ability to, still push the ball downfield when he needs to, but also can take something off of it in the short to intermediate routes, which allows him to be more accurate in that position as well. So I think all 3 quarterbacks have shown a lot of promise for Sark thus far in fall camp. And we know that Sark wants to dictate who the quarterback is a little bit sooner than he did last year and not kind of have to deal with the back and forth between Casey Thompson and Hudson Card like he did last year, this year with this group of quarterbacks. I think that Quinn Ewers still will eventually be the starter for this Longhorns football team. But I think it's really good that all 3 have gotten a lot better. We've heard about some missed throws from Hudson Card, but ultimately, like I said, he's been a lot more crisp. And we've heard about some interceptions for Quinn Ewers. And one thing I'll say is, although I think he is, more talented, he's more natural, and I think the accuracy and ball placement are really important for a quarterback and was why I would put him over Hudson Card. He can't keep throwing interceptions. That's something that plagued him in the spring and something that has plagued him in fall camp thus far. And if he continues to throw interceptions, I can be confident in Quinn Ewers and his talent level all day. But at the end of the day, this is a very important season for Sark, and this is a very important season for Texas football. And Sark has to be confident that the person he's putting out there isn't going to turn the ball over. Turnovers are killers, and typically turnover differential will tell you how good your football team is. And so, Quinn Ewers has all of the natural talent in the world, but at the end of the day, he has to throw it to the people in the burnt orange and white jerseys and not the other team. And so if the interceptions can't be cleaned up, then I think Sark is going to have to look at Hudson Card and maybe say he's the safer bet to be the starter this season. But I think Quinn Ewers is coachable. I think he's talented enough. I think he's smart enough to figure it out. And I think he will figure out that interception issue. And ultimately, I think he represents the best option at quarterback for the Longhorns going into the 2022 season. But once again, good stuff coming out of fall camp for all 3 of your top 3 quarterbacks on the depth chart, and Hudson Card, Quinn Ewers, and Maalik Murphy. And I think we'll find out soon how Sark has that order going into the season. Quick word from LinkedIn, and then we're going to talk about our pass catchers at tight end and wide receiver. As you gear up for fall, you need the right people on your team to help your small business fire on all cylinders. LinkedIn Jobs is here to make it easier to find the people you want to talk to faster and for free. Did you know that every week, nearly 40 million job seekers visit LinkedIn? Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. terms and conditions apply. So I think this Texas football team had a lot of talented playmakers at the wide receiver position last year, but for whatever reason, whether it was, shaky quarterback play, shaky offensive line play, or just the receivers not playing up to their potential, we saw a lot of drops and kind of misplays in the passing game last year. It really was Xavier Worthy or bust, and that was an area that Sark wanted to address in the offseason, and he addressed it in a big way. He brought in talented, speedy, four-star true freshman in Brennan Thompson, who runs a 10-2 in the 100, and somebody I know Sark is really excited to see how he can utilize this year. You brought in Isiah Neyor, who was one of the best receivers in the country last year, averaged 20 yards per reception, but doesn't get talked about as one of the best receivers in the country because he played at Wyoming, but definitely was very highly touted in the transfer portal. You're bringing in Tarique Milton, who Sark talked about as just a professional wide receiver. He talked about how he carries himself. He's very structured and off the field, and that translates to his work on the field, and he's really explosive in the slot, and he's somebody that they're going to use a lot this year. We know that Sark likes to use a lot of receivers, and so expect Tarique Milton, who started his career at Iowa State, to be a big part of the receiving core for the Longhorns. And ultimately he's insurance. Jordan Whittington hasn't shown the ability to stay healthy for a full season. We're hoping that this year is the year that happens. But it helps to bring in somebody in Tarique Milton, who once again has a lot of Big 12 experience at that slot position, and somebody who they feel like can come in and they won't miss a beat with Tarique Milton at that slot wide receiver position. And then you bring in an Agiye Hall, who is a bit of a question mark at this point, but we know that he's uber talented, and if you get the ball in his hands, he's always a threat to take it to the house. And then they brought in Jahleel Billingsley at the tight end position, but we've heard good things about JT Sanders and Gunnar Helm out of fall camp thus far. But really, it starts with the top three at the wide receiver position with Xavier Worthy, Isiah Neyor, and Jordan Whittington. And I really challenge you to put that against any top three of any receiver room in the country. You could say Ohio State, you could say USC. They have a lot of very talented receivers. But I think, Xavier Worthy, we saw what he did being one of the best receivers in the country last year. Jordan Whittington, who we as Texas fans know what he's capable of. This was a 5-star, top 50 player in the country coming out of high school, and just has been able to show it on the field in spurts, but hasn't been able to put together a consistent season because of those injuries. And then Isiah Neyor, who averaged 20 yards of reception and almost had 1,000 yards in an offense that threw the ball 35% of the time. He definitely is a legit NFL prospect, and a lot of people think he could end up being the wide receiver one this year. That's as talented as he is. And you talk about that top three, but then you throw names in there like a Troy O'Meary, who's looked good thus far, looks like a natural pass catcher. And we know as Texas fans, is uber talented, but has dealt with injuries thus far and hasn't made it into a season healthy. You talk about a Brennan Thompson, you talk about a Tarique Milton and a Agiye Hall and the depth behind them. You talk about a Casey Kane, a Jaden Alexis. You're talking about 8 to 9 receivers who legit can make an impact for this Texas football team this year. And I think that has to be really scary for opposing defenses, and really should be the biggest reason if you're going to hang on to anything as far as this team competing for a Big 12 championship this season. I won't say, playoff or anything. I think they're still a ways away from that. They have question marks on offense and defense, but at the minimum, I feel like they should be competing for a Big 12 championship game. And the biggest reason to kind of stake your claim in that or put your hat on that is just the amount of explosive potential they have on offense. And that's not to mention arguably the best running back room in the country, headlined by the best running back in the country with Bijan Robinson behind him with Roshan, Keelan Robinson, Jaden Blue, and Jonathan Brooks. And then you talked about the tight end position. There's been some questions about Jahleel Billingsley. He's been hurt thus far with a hamstring injury in fall camp. But there were some questions at Alabama whether he can put it all together, but Sark has faith in him. And we know that the tight end is really important in Sark's offense. And I think that Jahleel Billingsley will be a plus, just what he brings to the table and what they had last year. I think JT Sanders will really start to put it together this year. Really talented athlete out of Denton, who has all of the tools to be one of the best tight ends in the country. And I think Gunnar Helm is just steady at that tight end position. So regardless of who's at quarterback this year, whether it's Hudson Card, Quinn Ewers, or Maalik Murphy by circumstance, I think that they're going to have an embarrassment of weapons, not just a couple of very talented receivers and running backs. When you get down to the 4th and 5th best running backs, I mean, Jaden Blue was the number 1 running back in the country at one point before he opted out of his senior season. And then you talk about your 4th and 5th receivers. If that's Tarique Milton, has been one of the most consistent and best receivers in the Big 12 in that slot position. If you're talking about an Agiye Hall, who could be one of the most talented receivers in the country. If you're talking about a Brennan Thompson or a Xavier Worthy, another true freshman who's turned heads thus far, they talk about him as a natural pass catcher. This offense has 10 to 11 to 12 legitimate playmakers that can make an impact for this Texas football team this year. And once again, I think is the biggest reason for optimism going into the season that Texas can return to the Big 12 championship game for the first time since 2018. So we're going to talk about the defensive side and the defensive line. And we've talked a lot on this podcast, and really all the Texas content creators have talked about how this defensive line, has to step up from last year and be one of the biggest reasons that they improve. So this defense can improve, and they can improve on a 5-7 season. When you only have 20 sacks, the pass rush wasn't great. And we heard Pete Kwiatkowski at his press conference say, what pass rush? And I think there was a little bit of truth to that. And then when you look at the holes that were open in the run game, especially late in games last year, you're just not going to be able to win football games, given out the amount of yards they did and the amount of yards per carry they did in the run game last year. Not a lot to take away from the defensive line thus far in fall camp. They're in shorts, not full pads. But one thing that was interesting to me was to seeing that Alfred Collins, who is one of the most talented defensive players on this football team, especially on the defensive line, started off with the third team. It'll be interesting to see where he ends up when the season starts and how much of a role he has this year. We've heard a lot. The word we keep hearing with him is consistency. We know that he can make splash plays and is one of the most talented players on the roster. But for some reason, and once again coming into this camp, we see him starting off with the third team. It just hasn't been able to translate to on the field yet. So I'm hoping that towards the end of fall camp and going into the season, he can be a big contributor for this football team, because I think he's definitely one of the most talented defensive players on this football team. And the type of players you need a big season from for this team to improve on a defense that was in the triple digits last year in terms of production and yards given up. But they've talked about Ovie Oghoufo, how he's looked really good, and how he and that stable role is probably being your starting pass rusher throughout the year is going to surprise a lot of people. It's not going to be a world beater, but it has the potential to be really steady and give you a consistent pass rush. We know that it's really going to be a pass rush by committee with Barron Sorrells, Ovie Oghoufo, some talented freshmen in Jamon Tapp, Jere Bledsoe, and Justice Finkley. But really, it's going to have to come down to those big boys inside, those big talented players inside, in terms of being able to cause havoc up front and get right in the quarterback's lap, but also stopping those big holes we saw in the run game last year. And, I'm challenging Keandre Coburn, Tavondre Sweat, Byron Murphy, who I really like coming into his sophomore season, Moro Ojimo, those big guys up front to really cause havoc within that defensive line and take some pressure off of the edges and, be able to get to the quarterback, but then also, keep our linebackers clean, who we'll talk about next, so that they can make plays in the running game. And not have to worry about shedding tackles, but just getting to the ball carrier and bringing him down for a loss. So the defensive line is a big question mark going into the season and will dictate the success of this football team this year. I think they have the talent to do it, whether it's on the interior offensive line with players like Byron Murphy and Keandre Coburn, or on the edges with Ovie Oghoufo, Justice Finkley, Barron Sorrells, players like that. We'll also talk about next how they'll be using DeMarvion Overshawn as a pass rusher. But they're really going to have to put it together all on the field for this defense to be better and for this team to compete for a Big 12 championship. Quick word from Bet Online. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. Find all your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. Head to Bet Online today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening today. Bet Online, where the game starts. So we're talking about the linebackers, and I think one interesting development thus far, and we've talked about it a little bit on the podcast, and Sark kind of confirmed it, is the addition of Diamante Tucker-Dorsey. And we talked about him on the FCS level and how he was just a magnet around the ball. Over 110 tackles, 9 tackles for loss, multiple sacks, multiple forced fumbles, multiple interceptions. Now, he's a smaller player, not traditional size for a linebacker, but once again, just a player that has heart and a player that's always around the ball, and the type of players that this Texas football team needs on defense, the type of players that they haven't had in a while that can come right in and be assets to your football team. And I think Diamante Tucker-Dorsey has shown that already in fall camp. He's already had an interception, and I think he gives them a lot of confidence at that linebacker position next to Jalen Ford, who I'm really excited about. I've been rewatching all of these Texas games from last year, and the one thing that stands out to me, one of the biggest takeaways, I should say, is that Jalen Ford is a dude. He just flies off the screen. He jumps off the screen. He's athletic. His pursuit of the ball, is he gets to the ball carrier fast. Most people will remember when Oklahoma State scored late in the game. I think it was 23-25, and they were going on a 2-point conversion to try to tie the game against Texas. And Jalen Ford, they kind of do a little swing pass, a little check down out to the running back, and Jalen Ford just met him and stopped him, for no gain, and definitely stopped him from getting a 2-point conversion. And I think, because he was down on the depth chart last year, he didn't get a lot of playing time, but when he did, he flashed. But I think with him in a full-time starting role this season, that linebacker room is going to be a lot better. He flashes. He has the athleticism to play the position and dominate at the position. He has really good speed and pursuit coming downhill. He's athletic enough to make plays in the passing game, covering running backs and tight ends. And I think he has the mentality of a middle linebacker. He's smart enough to diagnose plays and stop plays before they become big gains on this defense. And I think Diamante Tucker-Dorsey has that same type of skill set, although a smaller player, just a player that consistently is around the ball, makes plays on the ball, and the type of player that has the heart and the fire that you want at the linebacker position to improve your defense and go out there and make plays in the run game and the passing game. And I think the addition of Diamante Tucker-Dorsey, as we talked about on this podcast, the addition of Diamante Tucker-Dorsey and the ability to put him and Jalen Ford at linebacker and have two really good inside linebackers allows you to be flexible with how you use DeMarvion Overshown. Of course, he's still going to play at kind of that off-ball linebacker role. But now, people have kind of called it the Michael Parsons role. As a Cowboys fan, I hesitate to say Michael Parsons because we're talking about an all-pro defensive player in the NFL. But to help visualize it, something like that. They're going to use him exclusively as a pass rusher a lot this season and a lot more than we saw last season. I think the ability to still have two really good linebackers in Diamante Tucker-Dorsey and Jalen Ford allows you to use DeMarvion Overshown in a variety of different ways. So he's still going to be in that off-ball linebacker spot. He's still going to be, downhill attacking the runner in the run game. He's still going to be covering, as a linebacker, tight ends, and running backs. But this is a team that's concerned about their pass rush. They missed out on O'Shawn Mathis over the summer, and they have a lot of talented players, but players that, are going to have to develop and get better over the season. And so I think one way to combat that is to use one of your most talented players and just say, go get the quarterback. And we're going to see a lot of that from DeMarvion Overshown this year. And a big reason for that is adding Diamante Tucker-Dorsey through the transfer portal and him and Jalen Ford being your two starting inside linebackers this year compared to last year is the reason that linebacker room is going to be a lot better going into the season. As far as the defensive back rooms to close it out, I think Deshaun Jamison has probably been the story on the defensive side going into fall camp. They said he's had 4 interceptions thus far. One of those in one practice, 3 in the other practice, a couple of those off of Quinn Ewers and Hudson Card. And, a lot of people have talked about how, they've seen enough of Deshaun Jamison at corner. Other people are a little more patient. I've kind of made the point that he's just a really talented playmaker. He's a talented corner. I think he takes a lot of challenges and sometimes a lot of chances, I should say, and sometimes he's out of position. But I think also, as we've continued to see at camp and as we've seen at times during the season, he just finds a way to get his hands on the ball. And I think that, turnovers are a big part of this game, as I talked about before, with Quinn Ewers throwing these interceptions in fall camp, coincidentally to Deshaun Jamison, but turnovers change games. And will Deshaun Jamison give up plays at times? Yeah, all corners do. But you also want that corner out there that's a threat to give you 4 or 5 interceptions every year. And I think Deshaun Jamison definitely is a threat to do that, as we've seen in the first week of fall practice with him already having 4 interceptions. I think Ryan Watts, the 6'3", the long corner, the transfer from Ohio State, I think that he gives them a lot of optimism that he can shut down over there at that corner position. Maybe not with smaller guys because he's big and probably doesn't have the speed and quickness that they have, but definitely against bigger receivers. I think he gives you a lot of confidence over there on the boundary at that corner position opposite from Deshaun Jamison. I think Jahdae Barron has been a stud since the spring at that star position, and I think he'll continue to do that. I think he gives them a really good corner and somebody that's always going to be on the field, whether it's in nickel, base, or whatever defense they're in. They're always going to have a spot for Jahdae Barron at corner. I think he's one of the best defensive backs thus far. And I think Terrence Brooks and Jalen Gilbo give you 2 really talented freshmen that can come in and spot play your corners at times. And I don't think that the production and the defensive back room drops off too much. Now, it still remains to be seen what safety will look like. You have two first-time players at the position, and Anthony Cook and Keaton Crawford. Now, I think that both of them are really talented playmakers, but once again, they're transitioning to a position they've never played before. And safety is very important to having a good defense. That's your last line of defense. And so we'll continue to see how they look. We haven't heard much coming from them out of fall camp thus far, but we'll continue to see how they look. Also, Brennan Thompson and then Mo Blackwell, how they'll get incorporated into that rotation as well. So really good things coming out of fall camp thus far. We'll continue to update you every couple of practices on what's going on with your Longhorn football team and how they look going into a very important season for Sark in year number two in 2022 as they get through these next couple of weeks of fall camp practices and start their first game en route to another Big 12 championship game on September 3rd against Louisiana-Monroe. Thank you, Longhorn Nation, for tuning in to another episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Jeez, your team every day. As always, peace.